Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful event. I'm Norma Levy, and I'm the president and founder of New Plaza Cinema. Today, we're looking forward to a lively discussion about that very special 1982 film uh, of Martin Scorsese called The King of Comedy with Robert De Niro and Jerry Lewis. And now I'm pleased to introduce the host of this talkback, our wonderful curator, Gary Palmucci. Gary?
Hi, Norma. Thank you very much. Well, with one of our greatest living filmmakers about to turn 80 years old next week, and apparently one of his most ambitious films on the horizon for release early next year, this seems like an ideal time to take another look at Martin Scorsese's King of Comedy. Back in the summer of 1981, King of Comedy was filming at various locations in Midtown Manhattan and on the Upper East and West Side. It seemed like on many late afternoons that summer, as I walked home from work from 9th Avenue across town to the East Side, I would frequently encounter the production company shooting somewhere as if for my own and thousands of other New Yorkers' personal delectation. For example, at those long gone payphones near Times Square, where Robert De Niro monopolizes a phone, waiting for an unlikely call back while others fume, including members of the great band The Clash, who were in the kind of peak of their fame at that moment. The big argument between Robert De Niro and Sandra Bernhard on 49th Street and Broadway, across from the cavernous, long gone Rivoli movie theater. 53rd Street and Park Avenue, where the Jerry Lewis character gets kidnapped, sort of. And East 58th Street between First and York Avenues, the site of Jerry Lewis's character's penthouse apartment with all those TV screens, including one of them tuned to Scorsese favorite Sam Fuller's Pickup on South Street. It was a laborious 19-week shoot, very expensive, that didn't connect with audiences at all, really, in its original theatrical release. But over time, the prescient dark humor of King of Comedy, as I think we'll all agree today, has come to be much better appreciated, to the point where for many of us, I think it's now considered one of Scorsese's best and most daring pictures, although at that time he would certainly not have said so. And we'll get into a little bit of that later. Max, I think the trailer you have here is from the original release.
Yes, this is the original release from 20th Century Fox, and it seems so slowly paced, of course, to what we're used to seeing. But let's see how 20th Century Fox attempted to sell this very, very challenging and most unconventional ultra dark comedy. Here's the original King of Comedy trailer.
And I'm thinking as I'm sitting here now, well, maybe this is my big break. This is my big chance. You know what I mean?
You don't just walk on to a network show without experience. Now, I know it's an old hackneyed expression, but it happens to be the truth. You've got to start at the bottom.
I know. That's where I am, at the bottom.
That's a perfect place to start.
So will you please give your warmest greetings to the newest King of Comedy, Rupert Pupkin.
His name is Rupert Pupkin. He lives in a world of make-believe.
Oh, Jerry, I love this guy. Always coming up with these great lines. I love him. I love him.
Nobody can remember his name.
Mr. Pipkin. Mr. Pupnik.
Mr. Puffer.
Rupert.
Pupkin, P-U-P-K-I-N.
But by 11:30 tonight, the whole world will know that Rupert Pupkin is the new King of Comedy. Robert De Niro, Jerry Lewis, in a Martin Scorsese picture, The King of Comedy.
I actually retract that statement. That is a very smoothly paced trailer. It's under 90 seconds. And of course, I love the fact that they announced the title very early on, as well as at the end, which they stopped doing.
It is a good trailer, and you can see even in the trailer in this movie, God is in the details, from the name of Robert De Niro's character to those hilarious cutouts on the set, to that red tie, which is omnipresent on Robert De Niro throughout the film. It drove some people nuts, but I think now of us see the kind of mad genius of the whole plot line.
My memory of the film was originally seeing it in, I think it was the Plaza Theater or the Regent Theater. I think it was the Plaza in Westwood in 1983, and absolutely coming out of the theater hating every second of it and just couldn't believe what Scorsese had done. And maybe 6 months later, I was watching cable TV and King of Comedy was on, and I found myself laughing and laughing and laughing and cringing in a good way and getting what the film was finally about. And then 2 years later, when After Hours was released, I remember there was a review in I think it was the LA Weekly, where the critic referenced John Huston having the same reaction to King of Comedy as I had. He hated it when he first saw it, and then he watched it on cable TV and loved it and totally changed his views on it.
We can just hear a big belly laugh coming from John Huston right there as he's watching it somewhere in the
Absolutely. And when I revisited it the other night, it registered with me that I think one of the reasons I was so uncomfortable watching it, on top of all the other reasons any American would be uncomfortable watching this cringeworthy indictment of the unhealthy American obsession and celebrity glorification. And when I saw the film originally, I was a secretary at an entertainment company. And we were used to dealing with people in the lobby trying to get in to see executives. They had a script. Can so-and-so read it? He knows who I am. Please let me in. And maybe it just struck too close to home at the time. I couldn't.
And you probably had one of those bouncers like the fellow in the Jerry Langford office who comes out and tries to talk reasonably at first to Robert De Niro, and things start off reasonably, and then he winds up getting physically thrown out of the building.
You did have the security aspect of it, but this film today definitely has even more relevance when we think that this was made before the internet, before reality TV, before YouTube made everybody a star, regardless of whether they had talent or not. And you see this movie, and it's incredibly sobering. My reaction, and I've seen it since then, in addition to my recent viewing. And I remember the first hour, I'm laughing quite a bit, and then you stop laughing because it's really getting uncomfortable, especially when Rupert and the Rita characters show up at Jerry's house, and it's getting a little on the icky side. And it's also important to remember, and I mentioned this a little bit on Wednesday at the Scorsese lecture, that this project came out of some pretty horrible real life situations that were connecting to Scorsese De Niro films. There was the whole John Hinckley watching Taxi Driver and communicating with Jodie Foster and then trying to kill Reagan when he was president. And then there was the awful case with the Raging Bull actress Teresa Saldana was nearly stabbed to death by a crazy stalker.
That's right.
She lived to tell about it. And that when Scorsese and De Niro were offered this project, they felt, hey, I think the time is ripe to really satirize and go after the fan culture.
The screenplay was by, I think the only screenplay, a former Newsweek film critic, Paul Zimmerman. And you know, as you said, 3 months before they started shooting had been the assassination attempt on President Reagan, and the attack on Teresa Saldana, I believe, was that same year as well.
Exactly. So there was some very intense real life situations that led them to do this take on the culture, the fan culture, which we remember is short for fanatic, and Pupkin's character in particular, right down to the basement monologues and very uncomfortable rehearsals and fantasies.
That of course, many people will recognize that's Mrs. Scorsese there, who's constantly yelling down from the kitchen for him to keep the volume down, you know, when he's doing his recordings. You know, I don't mind what you're saying, but just not so loud.
As in Mama Scorsese, Catherine.
Yes, that's
Catherine. Right. And also what I noticed the other night in the very first scene when Rupert is outside the television studio waiting for Jerry to come out with the crazy fans, right behind him, briefly, Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio.
Who would later, she would later be a Scorsese player in The Color of Money.
Exactly.
That is one of my favorite freeze frames. I think the opening, the title card when it comes on and we see the window closing and Sandra Bernhard, screaming and everybody kind of ducking or whatever in one direction or another, and then freezing on the title. That's a beautiful beginning.
And that was a title designed by Dan Perry, who had previously did the titles for Taxi Driver in New York, New York, and was bringing a new artistic sensibility to title design in the post Saul Bass era.
Mm-hmm.
The structure of the film today, I think, is easier to follow than it originally. We take for granted, for example, some of the editing tricks they were playing, the Sardi's restaurant fantasy, where you see De Niro and Lewis at Sardi's,
Yes.
and then they intercut that with Rupert in his basement having this delusional
Rupert,
fantasy.
I want you to take over the show for 6 weeks, just 6 weeks. I can't take over my life for 6 weeks.
And then going back and forth seamlessly, and that was pretty unusual for a mainstream feature. Other aspects of the editing are a bit on the rough side. I think for a film as massively budgeted as this, it's maybe a little puzzling where, and this is not uncommon in some of Scorsese's work, where because there's improvisation or there's from take to take, they're probably doing different emphasis on certain lines. There is not always a smoothness in how the scenes are put together. When we think of Jerry and Rupert in the limousine in the beginning, you can see as they're cutting from angle to angle, people are moving around less fluidly than they normally would. And there is a particularly jarring example when when Rupert and Masha are walking past the Brill building and they stop to talk, or they're yelling at each other, and then we cut to Sandra Bernhard and the camera is tracking, and then we cut back to De Niro and it's stationary. That's one of the weirdest editing gaffes I've seen. But
well, it was apparently, I don't know I guess it must have seemed like a great idea to just shoot the film right in the middle of Midtown and Times Square and so forth. And but it went on and on and on for many weeks, way over budget. And I think was very arduous personally for Scorsese. And in an interview several years later, he was describing the production. He said, imagine when a shoot gets so difficult, and he's talking to the guys who were, documentary filmmakers, what production is like. He says, you get to the point, imagine getting to the point where you don't care about the picture anymore. And that's what he said at the time. I find that a little hard to believe coming from him, but
it is. I mean, he claimed he'd been coming off of 3 other pictures. He'd done New York, New York, and The Last Waltz and Raging Bull pretty much back to back. And then this project was thrown his way. And as you said, it was a very expensive film at the time, costing around 19 to 20 million. In today's currency, that's over 62 million. That's a lot of money. And also, you mentioned the shoot. Officially, they have the film starting production in June of 1981, but they clearly went back for some pickup shots, because the Times Square shots, if you're like me and like any other movie fan, we're always looking at the movie marquees to see what's showing. Sure. They're showing The World According to Garp. They're showing Blade Runner, which came out in the summer of '82.
Exactly.
So they clearly went back and did some pickup shots for some of those. And when you see these scenes in Times Square and near the Paramount Plaza building, where De Niro and Sandra Bernhard are walking, there seem to be people stopping and staring. So they had extras, but they also, you have to wonder if some of that was done candidly as well. It's fascinating.
Or a hidden camera, because Midnight Cowboy has some famous shots like that a decade earlier. But yeah,
precisely. And Dan will talk more about the cinematography of the film, but one element that Scorsese plays around with is in the fantasies, using videotape for part of the fantasies, including the fantasy online, or that's a 21st century term, network marriage between him and Masha.
That's right.
Shot on videotape.
Victor Borga and Dr. Joyce Brothers, fresh from the Johnny Carson show. And another beautiful bit of parody, that ridiculously inane lead-in music to the show, which of course is goofing on the many talk show intros of that time. Our friend Dave Kerr over at the Museum of Modern Art, 2 or 3 years ago, he put together a program, I think mostly of a tribute to Jerry Lewis, but he put the King of Comedy and the Nutty Professor together on sort of a double feature, and he feels these films had some kind of kinship, which I'm not quite sure I can explain verbally, but I feel like he's right in my head. What do you think of that?
Well, let's see. You do have Rupert trying to take over the Jerry Langford character. You do have in The Nutty Professor, you have the Jerry Lewis character. He's two personalities.
The ultra dweeb and the ultra slick musician
Yes.
Buddy Love, is that his name?
Buddy Love, exactly. And you have what are some other elements that stood out for me in, oh, you talk about the talk show satire. Clearly there seemed to be a modeling on the Tonight Show setup,
Right.
where we see Jerry in the beginning. He's Ed Hurley is standing in for Ed McMahon, and then there's the guy running the band who's clearly the Doc Severinsen character. It's and apparently Johnny Carson had been approached to play the Jerry Langford part originally and turned it down, but that the Tonight Show was credited as having provided some technical information on these things. But we also have Fred DeCordova, the producer of the Tonight Show, playing presumably the producer of the Jerry Langford Show as well.
That's another terrific scene where he's the guy who gets on the phone and he thinks the call is fake. And
Yes.
he says, talks to the young man, I think his name is Martino. And he said, how many times have we told you, Martino, not to stop calling? And then somehow or other, that Jerry Langford convinces him that it's really him. And then there's a guy sitting nearby, a business manager, who said, I want you to know, we're going to sue them all. And he is in fact a guy named Jay Julian, a famous actor, a business manager of that time. So these guys were cast to type for sure.
Absolutely. And there's weird things. This goes back to some of the editing continuity, but here's one thing that was clearly deliberate. There's the scene where Rupert is having dinner or drinks with Rita, the Diane Abbott character, and there's that man in the background with the beard. I maybe Dan might discuss that at some point, but he's kind of at a booth in the background. Then he's gone. Then he's crossing behind De Niro. Then he's back there, and he's imitating De Niro's gestures. And then he gets up to leave.
I am going to show that in my presentation.
Then I will say nothing more about that until, thank you, Dan. So I can't wait to hear what Dan's theories are about that.
There's a number of cameos in that bar scene. There's Marty's dad, Charlie Scorsese. He's sitting at the bar at the very end when the Rupert goes on national television, and also the character we know from Goodfellas, known as Murray the Hairpiece King, a gentleman named Chuck Lowe, who I guess was a friend of Robert De Niro's. He's also in that bar scene.
And I think one of the bar patrons, or at one point, is Mardick Martin, the screenwriter who co-wrote Mean Streets.
Yeah, kind of a forgotten figure in the Scorsese biography, collaborator on Mean Streets and Who's That Knocking on My Door, I think.
And New York as well.
Right,
so,
passed away, I think, a few years ago.
Yeah, that's really, really unfortunate. And so there's a lot of in-jokes here. I'm just remembering bits and pieces of interviews. A number of years later, Sandra Bernard was interviewed about the King, or in an interview, she mentioned the King of Comedy, and she indicated that her memories were that Jerry Lewis was not comfortable with some of the improvisation that was going on, that he felt it was unprofessional. And
Yes.
She also felt he was scared of her. I can't imagine why.
Well, just as Joe Pesci and Kathy Moriarty in Raging Bull were sort of casting miracles, I think she's kind of a casting miracle, perhaps not in the way that everyone intended, but certainly a memorable performance.
Yes, and it takes some while to get used to her on screen, but the scene at the candlelight scene, I think she's quite outstanding, where he's all taped up and
that's what Jerry Lewis really has to. He's like completely taped up, and he's got that look of boiling rage that has to build from, and that's like a 10 or 15 minute scene, I believe, or something. It's pretty long anyway.
It is, and it's a tribute to both of them, that the fact that he has to really be the reactor rather than the actor in that scene. And
well, maybe we should hear from Dan about what his investigations have yielded here. Besides,
yes, So Dan Dan Cahill is our cinematography expert. He's a filmmaker, and he's also been a film educator as well. And Dan usually takes us through the cinematographic look of these films. Dan, what are your theories on the King of Comedy? And welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here. This is the infamous freeze frame title card, which is a real work of art. It sums up a lot of what's going to happen in the film. I want to talk at first about how the major characters are first introduced to us. This is another video shot, which happens in the film, and it's very appropriate for this TV star character that Rupert wants to befriend. So he's shown hosting a Tonight Show lookalike. This is our first, actually, it's the second shot we see of De Niro, and I think it's interesting body language that he does the sort of humble, self-effacing, hand over the mouth thing as he's contemplating how close to go to get an autograph. He doesn't really show much self-effacing behavior later, now does he? This pretty much sums up Sandra Bernhard's role. Wonderful shot I happened to capture. She's trapped in Jerry's car, which is not exactly where she wants to be. I'm showing you this shot now. This is about a minute or two into their conversation scene at the start of the film. And I'm just citing this frame to note the fan in the background who has been running alongside the car, and he's there, as is the fan in the bar scene. Now, just a brief digression here to introduce Rita. I am shocked that neither of you gentlemen mentioned the fact that at the time, Diane Abbott was Mrs. Robert De Niro.
Well, we're just bursting with trivia here. We didn't get to that.
Yeah.
She was.
So I'm glad I scooped that one up. She, I think, lasted until '88 as his wife. And
She had that wonderful, well, she had a couple of wonderful cameos. She plays the porno theater candy seller in Taxi Driver, and she has her wonderful performance of Honeysuckle Rose in New York, which some of us remember.
Yeah. So anyway, back to the guy in the background thing. This is a different guy, but this is what Max was just referencing, is the shots of De Niro taking Rita out to dinner. And this guy, when they're in a two-shot, sort of establishing where they are, the guy walks by their table, looks hard at De Niro, and then goes and sits down behind him in the background. And once you realize he's there, he's really distracting because he's watching their scene. At one point, he appears to be talking to someone across the table from him, but there is no one across the table from him. It's very strange. I'm just putting it all in the category of more fan behavior, which is one of the themes of the film. This was referenced by Gary a little while ago. I think this is sort of a mock-up of what Scorsese's living room looks like. We know he is an obsessive film viewer and collector, and the film indeed is Pick Up on South Street, a wonderful Sam Fuller film with Richard Widmark and Gene Peters that you all should watch if you haven't. And I love the fact that there are two screens, Jerry's obscuring one, with color bars on them, which was sort of in that era the default way that you made sure your TV was working properly. So this is kind of a carryover from where Marty goes every night, I'm sure.
Or his trailer, perhaps.
Yes. This is a salute to Boris Levin, the production designer. He created some really interesting and strange sets here, including this lobby/waiting room for Jerry's production company, which they use very effectively. More production design. This is Jerry's office. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable working under a ceiling like that, but I do have to cite, and those of you who know my commentaries know I'm not a big fan of low-level physical comedy, but I love this bit. It still makes me laugh. It kind of reminds me of somebody recently in the headlines, another guy named Jerry Lewis, who wrote a song called A Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On. And that's exactly what they're doing. I just love the way they play this. I hope they got it right on the first take. Or
Not likely.
De Niro's chiropractor might have been called to the set. I don't know. Okay, here is something else that was mentioned. This is, by the way, despite Max's citing of some editing glitches in these sequences, they are really beautifully choreographed for the most part. That The extras are the people you see larger than life, not larger than life, but they're the larger people in the background. But if you look carefully between Sandra Bernhard and the guy with glasses going by, you can see real life gawkers lined up in front of the dark building in the background. And similarly, right behind De Niro's neck, you can see them. So there are limits to what what was it, $19 million budget can do for crowd control, but I think they managed it very effectively. I just love this shot. I mean, you couldn't find this shot today. You'd have to set up the phone booths, but it's Rupert kind of guarding his domain and carrying his folders with him.
That's what we see Joe Strummer and the rest of the Clash, and I believe that's 43rd Street and Broadway. No longer there.
Yep. This is just a typical New York street scene that Scorsese would have loved. I don't know who the actress is, but my favorite part is that once she turns on Jerry, Jerry turns away from her, and I just love the business as usual look on his face.
If I could just interject for just a second, Dan, apparently this scene was based on a real experience Lewis had with a woman on the street, and that Lewis apparently directed the actress in the timing of that gag. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. I'm glad it originated with a real incident. Now we're going to talk a bit about how Scorsese deploys the camera. Some of his compositions are really interesting, and I love the way he tends to frame Pupkin sort of out of the main action. Half the frame here is a sort of a blank wall and some interesting decor. Once again, Boris Levin at work, I imagine. And there he and the security guy are isolated. We can still hear their talk, but it's just an interesting way to isolate him, as is this at Jerry's house, how as Rupert is losing it, he is framed isolated visually. Everybody can hear him, but it's a nice setup of keeping him apart from the other more normal people, shall we say. There are various chase scenes throughout the office, and I just love the fact that this is the chaser, not the chasee, that we glimpse through the open doorway. And there's some back and forth there, almost like a Buster Keaton setup. And here at last, Marty is able to move the camera, and we know he loves to follow somebody through a space to set up the environment, as he did so famously in Goodfellas. And here we're following behind De Niro as he's looking for Jerry in the office. This is the aforementioned Sardi's scene. And I want to call your attention to the way it's filmed. Everything here is completely normal looking. This is how you would set up the lights for a standard Hollywood shot of two people having lunch together. But this is not a real shot. This is a fantasy of Rupert's. And when we cut to real life, note how the lighting changes. He's darker. He's not as exquisitely lit. And that's because he's in his home, which he has described in a shouting match with Masha as a hovel, compared to her place, which is a townhouse. And we'll get there momentarily. This is one of those shots that you go, huh? I'm crediting Boris Levin with this. This has to be an imaginary space. We know that Rupert doesn't live in this space. It's evocative of a guy with truly tunnel vision at this point, who is living in his own small world with a photograph of an audience, not a real audience. But
it was also used, Dan, excuse me, also used as the cover of the soundtrack album, that particular shot.
Oh, I had no idea, but it's evocative, certainly. Here is another moment in the film. Rita, while at Jerry's country house, steals a little object from the table. This shot lasts maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and it's never referred to before or since. all we learn is that Rita may be a kleptomaniac. I don't know. But it's there, and they could have cut it out, but it just adds a little something to the film. Now, when we finally get to Masha's house, it's very opulent. And I was kind of surprised by the candlelit atmosphere when I saw it recently. But then I realized there are hints that Masha is not exactly impoverished. She's driving a Mercedes with a vanity plate here, and you've got to see it a couple of times to notice that detail. Here we are, we're finally in Masha's living room. And if you look hard at the background, you can see the candelabras and the fancy decor, but we are distracted from that by Jerry's modeling of the sweater that she has made for him, which also makes me laugh. It's, we don't quite know where we are, and we aren't thinking about it until this erupts. Once Rupert has taken off, she is ready to go. And the candles really tell the story here as she's preparing her seduction. As she is singing Come Rain or Come Shine, wonderful Harold Arlen, Johnny Mercer tune from 1946, by the way. What this shot is about is the candles. We don't get to see Jerry's reaction, which we've seen other times. And this is sort of deep into her performance of the tune. So what he's saying is that the setting is just as important as their activities. Rupert's triumph at last, another great moment in the film. I just love the fact that he's standing on the bar, triumphant, looking and admiring himself on TV. Finally made it to the big time. And how does Jerry learn about this? By something that you just don't see anymore, the store window full of TV sets. And this is almost a cliche from the 1950s monster movie where the dinosaur is about to invade the city and the military are going on all these TV screens to tell people to take cover. But we don't have those stores anymore, I don't think. I haven't seen one in a long, long time. And finally, last shot of the film, just in case you didn't understand that it was about celebrity culture, they kind of rub your nose in it here with the media going nuts over Rupert Pupkin. So that is the end of my presentation, gentlemen. And once again, I have to take my hat off to Jerry Lewis for giving, I think, one of the best performances of his career.
Scorsese felt that the performance was very underrated, that Lewis should have gotten more recognition for it, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, indeed.
It wasn't until after seeing the film, maybe another viewing, I realized, and I'm sure this was part of the intention all the time, in addition to being a merciless commentary on our celebrity culture, it could be interpreted as a comic turn on Taxi Driver. Because Taxi Driver, when we think about it, culminates with this psychotic becoming a media celebrity because he killed the right people instead of the wrong people. And you have the newspaper headlines about Travis Bickle.
Well, yeah, not to quite the same extent, I don't think, Max. I think what we saw in Taxi Driver, we see something like a New York Post type headline pinned to the wall saying hero cab driver returns to work.
Yeah, you're right. He's not on television.
This is really over the top,
over the top. The Monthly Film Bulletin in England cited what they thought was glib irony in the King of Comedy. So I guess with that final touch that Dan referring to, perhaps rubbing our noses in it just a bit. Jerry Lewis apparently said in an interview long ago that he had suggested that Rupert kill the Jerry Langford character at the end, but that was overruled, and he felt the picture was lacking a proper finish. Interesting.
Maybe he just wanted a death scene. I don't know that he had that many death scenes in his career. Have either of you ever encountered The Day the Clown Cried?
Still pretty tough to see, I think.
No.
Okay.
I was at the Library of Congress when the 35mm cans arrived from some source, and they were on a like a loading dock, but that was the closest I got to it.
Maybe maybe for those who are not familiar with the day the clown cried, you guys could give a little synopsis. I think you know a little bit more about it than I do, and we
Well,
should get it right.
Jerry plays a clown who ends up in a death camp in World War II with a lot of children. And all I know is that he goes to his death with the children. And maybe Max knows more than I do, but
Yeah, so the film went into production around 1972, and it was based on a literary source, and I believe there hadn't been there were rights clearance issues that led to the film being considered an unauthorized version of the literary source, which prevented it from being released. And at the time, people thought, well, this is an outrageous idea. What's Jerry Lewis doing, dealing with the Holocaust and a clown? But then in 1997, 98, we have Roberto Benigni making Life is Beautiful.
well,
So-
yeah, a generation later. I mean,
Exactly.
you know, they could get away with it then, but
Lewis was quoted as saying he didn't release the movie ultimately because he didn't think it was that good of a picture. Some people who saw sections of it felt that it was better than its reputation. I don't think it was helped by the fact that back in the late 80s, I believe it was, Spy Magazine did a big article about the day the clown cried, interviewing people who had seen it, who were kind of scratching their heads and trying to cobble together a film that Spy Magazine assumed to be totally ridiculous. And that didn't help the reputation.
In his will, if I remember correctly, now there's some access to the film can be granted sometime in the next decade or so. I think it's not completely going to be kept in mothballs. I think he did allow some access to it in his will or something. So we may hear more about that film. I think, but so of course at the time King of Comedy was made, Jerry had made a couple of independent films, unsuccessful, but he was far removed from his perch as one of the biggest movie stars, the biggest entertainers in America. Scorsese, in one article I remember, described his dad taking him to see Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin at the Paramount Theater live in 1948 when he was 6 years old, and something that he had never forgotten.
I would recommend to anyone who has even a small interest in Martin and Lewis, Turner Classic Movies did a wonderful documentary within the last year on Dean Martin. And there is a lot of footage of those two guys touring to promote their early films. And indeed, my dad took me to one of these big theaters, and it was like the Beatles, but with screaming little kids, not teenage girls.
Yes.
And it was total pandemonium. We couldn't really hear anything they were saying, but they were really well known for improv comedy. In particular, when they appeared on live TV, like late night shows, they would go nuts. But by the time they got to Hollywood, they were kind of scripted into situations that didn't really suit their wild weirdness. So they were the biggest thing in Hollywood in their heyday, and not so anymore.
And I believe Peter Bogdanovich, when because he published an extensive interview with Jerry Lewis in his book about movie stars. If memory serves, he said that Lewis starred in 16 consecutive hits in a row, which broke the record of many stars. And Lewis is he's the celebrity that most Americans refuse to acknowledge ever liking. I mean, the guy was a massive star, but nobody wants to admit ever going to his films. And it took the French to really recognize his work in the 1960s and appreciate some of the surrealistic narratives and his even avant-garde approaches to comedy at times. But the stuff was massive, and he was starring in and directing his own pictures till around 1970. And then he made the Day the Clown Cried, which wasn't shown, but it is going to be almost another decade. As Gary said, he's going to make some independent films like Hardly Working, which got picked up by Fox and did okay. But the big days of directing major films were behind him.
And I think part of his success was that he appealed to the boomer generation, that's me, when we were little kids.
Yes.
And when a little kid says, I gotta go see Martin and Lewis, your mom and dad took you. I mean, there was, and they
Yes.
were kind of maybe interested a little bit themselves, but I think it was mainly a kid-driven audience.
I remember seeing It's Only Money. I think he didn't direct that. That was directed by Frank Tauscher. But when I was 7 years old, when he's getting chased by a series of power lawnmowers or something that have gone haywire. That's
Okay, since we're confessing here, this sounds like an exaggeration, but I swear to you, my very first memory of a film image in the cinema is a woman in a car trying to parallel park and bumping the car in front of her and behind her. And for decades, I couldn't figure out what this movie was until one day I was doing some data entry work and I happened to have Jerry Lewis's The Patsy on DVD and I was watching it. It was from The Patsy. So my first exposure or memory of a film is a Jerry Lewis picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
well, and Max, we were discussing the other day, and I think you have an interesting anecdote about this, that the failure of the film at the time kind of resulted in kind of the low point of Scorsese's career, and that he was trying to get The Last Temptation of Christ made right after this film, and its box office failure, plus some early protests and pressure on the studio, prompted President Michael Eisner to pull the plug on Last Temptation. And Marty tried to get the film off the ground unsuccessfully elsewhere, including one of your former employers, right?
Right. So Scorsese has made Taxi Driver, which did very well commercially. He follows it up with New York, New York, which was an expensive failure. I said recently it had the misfortune of opening up the same week as Star Wars in 1977. Then he makes The Last Waltz, a dignified so-so performer, and then Raging Bull, which, believe it or not, we regard highly today, but was also a failure when it came out. So yes, and then this Last Temptation of Christ disappointment happens at Paramount. So not long after the release of King of Comedy, I was working at ABC Motion Pictures, which was a theatrical arm of ABC. It was their second attempt to enter feature film production. I was the secretary to the assistant of the president, Brandon Stoddard. And sure enough, the Martin Scorsese came into the office one day to pitch The Last Temptation of Christ. And his secretary and I were on very bad terms. We did not like each other. So I waited for her to leave the office and hang out with another secretary. And I did a very Rupert Pupkin-like thing. I snuck into the outer office, put my ear to the door so I could listen to the pitch meeting. And I heard little bits and pieces where Stoddard was asking Scorsese, so tell me, what stage is this project in right now? Tell me more about it. And Scorsese, who was going through his rapid speech pattern days, was saying, well, this is a film about Jesus Christ as a man, not so much as a big religious figure, but as a man. And I remember, so that was the pitch. And I then I heard the secretary coming, so I ran back to my desk. But that was one of the first 3 times I saw Martin Scorsese in person.
Well, that's it. So it was kind of a nadir for him, and then he took on, I think, smartly, as it turned out, a couple of films where you could almost say are like commissioned projects in some ways. After Hours for producer David Geffen, and then The Color of Money at the Disney studio, with a sort of sequel to The Hustler. But both of those movies turned out well and got him to the next level, where he was then able to make The Last Temptation of Christ with help from various powers that be.
Well, he was even reduced to directing an episode of Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories, which
That's
had
right.
to be the
Well, a lot of name directors jumped onto that. Clint Eastwood did an episode of that series
Burt
also.
Reynolds, and yeah, it was a strange experience. So yes, After Hours, it was much more modestly budgeted than some of Scorsese's recent films, and that enabled him to get in the door to do some other films. Dan, do you have anything to add about any additional thoughts on the look of The King of Comedy? Because I remember going to see it, a lot of us were disappointed by the look, and I think we missed the point, because could it be argued that Scorsese was trying to get more of a TV look in a lot of situations? Because we're used to the Michael Chapman glossy look of Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I cited with the Sardi's scene, it's very normal. And I cite this a lot in my criticisms, is that those normal scenes I mean, I was talking about him in The Day the Earth Stood Still and a few other films that we've done where they're contrasted with something eerie and supernatural or fantastic or weird. But this movie is mostly taking place in the real world of studios and offices and waiting rooms. So indeed, there isn't a lot of inventive photography. And the DP on this, Fred Schuler, is not a particularly well-known person. Didn't
I think Gordon Willis, assistant cameraman, I think originally, that's his background.
Okay.
He worked on The Godfather, I think, among others.
Okay.
probably, yeah.
Most interesting. Well, this has been so fascinating, gentlemen. I know we're going to have some questions and thoughts from the audience. Dan, you had some announcements coming up for us at
Oh,
Newcastle?
that can wait till the end.
That can wait till the end.
Yeah,
Well,
about
we're-
what our next project that's coming up. But
terrific. Dan will tell us more about that. So in the meantime, we can turn to Lori. Unless Laura, you have something you'd like to add, we can start taking questions. and thoughts.
I'm going to show everyone a slide at the end for the next lecture. So we'll do that. So let's take some questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand, you can use the reaction button. Let's see. Someone's asking, how was Jerry Lewis convinced to take this role?
He didn't have too much else to do at the time, I think. And plus, I'm sure that Scorsese expressed sufficient admiration and deference and even, worship of him too. And I don't think he enjoyed himself on the shoot. He was, flabbergasted that it took so long. And he said, well, you're paying for my time. It's okay, and so forth. But
he has kind of a dyspeptic look on his face through most of the film.
to say the least.
Yeah.
I would agree with that, Dan, for sure.
So apparently he was approached by Scorsese. According to one account, originally the project was conceived as a Bob Fosse, Andy Kaufman project, with Sammy Davis Jr. playing the Jerry Longford character. That would have, but then Fosse said, "I think I'm going to do Star 80, the Dorothy Stratton-Sich story."
And then someone also asked, what was the relationship between Masha and Rupert?
It went back to their school days. He had a big crush on her, but was too shy to say anything. And he was coming back years later to try to impress her. That was my take on it in their scenes together. Anybody else?
She has a beautiful line where she just says, "Rupert, what do you want?"
Yeah.
That just kind of says.
You're talking about Rita.
Oh, Masha, I'm sorry.
Masha and Rupert.
Yeah.
Masha and
Oh,
Rupert,
excuse me.
just a fellow fan. That's my bad.
They just
and I
sort of,
apologize.
to me, they just sort of probably met up, and the many times they've spent hours and hours waiting for him at the side door.
Yeah. They often were in competition for an autograph. And as we saw in the opening scene, people were trading them back and forth.
No,
Well, and Rupert even says to her at one point, all he's done for her, I gave you this, I did this, I'd let you have my spot and all that stuff,
But that question, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that they probably could have done a little more background development on Rupert and Masha, just to give us a bit more of a backgrounder. But we got a little bit in that argument scene you mentioned, Lori.
Yeah. Someone asked the waitress, or is telling us the waitress in the scene with Rita and Rupert was Scorsese's daughter. So
that's correct.
Yeah. I noticed the name Scorsese a lot in the credits. And I was watching the credits. What I also noticed is a lot of times in transitions when he's going into places where he's about to be a little weird, that the angles were very Dutch and sort of like disoriented, like with mirrors and stuff. And the other thing I couldn't help thinking is if the set, which is behind me, was not inspired, did not inspire the makers of Seinfeld when Kramer stole or inherited the Merv Griffith set. Does anyone remember that? It was very reminiscent of this movie.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Seinfeld, Laurie, because when we're getting towards that final act in King of Comedy, there's that quote unquote writer who's trying to crash through the guards to get onto the show. He has kind of almost an afro frizzy hair. He sounded exactly like Jason Alexander. And I was wondering, is this a younger Jason Alexander? But I couldn't find any.
No, he
information
is
about
actually
that.
a friend of Marty's at the time. His name is Bill Minkham. I think he was in the business somewhere or another, but that was not Jason Alexander.
Thank you for clarifying that, because the voice was identical.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Marianne.
Please.
In fact, Claude is asking if the film influenced the dark character of the Joker in the Batman film.
Hard to say. In other words, did the Rupert Pupkin character influence? Hard to say, because the Joker was already a visible character on the TV series of Batman, and
he certainly takes it much further. And ironically, Robert De Niro is the TV host. I guess there's sort of a weird transposition there, some 30 some odd years later or whatever, in that Joker film.
Well, let me ask you this question, you guys, is when we finally do see Rupert perform, he's really not that bad. Is that, are we seeing Rupert's spiel through Rupert's eyes?
that's the question.
You know,
Because you can't help wondering, is it canned laughter? Is this all in his mind?
Right. Because he was kind of funny. I mean, it wasn't like amazing, but he wasn't horrible, as horrible as I thought we all thought he would be.
I did not take that as a fantasy. I took that as, he's on TV, he's on the magazine covers, that he succeeded. He did well, and he had some good patter, I'm not a big fan of that kind of comedy, but in that realm, he was pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And it was all done in 1 5-minute videotape take.
Yeah.
Which was kind of, it's kind of, and I'm sorry, going back to the taxi driver thing, it was a comic equivalent of the unbelievable violence and brutality that we saw in Taxi Driver, that culmination of bloodshed. This was a culmination of comedy, which was brought on by kidnapping somebody and threatening them with a gun.
And I had another question, please. This Marsha character, what did become of her? Because I thought she was so horrible.
The actress. Well, the actress Sandra Bernard is a stand-up comedian, and she had a very big run in the 1980s, and even did a film
some film roles after that, but nothing.
It was more of a stand-up.
More of a stand-up. She did a film of her own called Without You, I'm Nothing, kind of a record of her stand-up comedy. But she did a lot of stand-up comedy after this time.
And your question, Marianne, was technically, I believe you asked, what about the character of Masha? Well, the last time we see Masha, she's running down the street in her underwear. Okay. So I don't think she was destined for great success.
Thank you.
Okay, Joshua, you want to start your video and unmute yourself and ask your question? Anyone else has a question? Please raise your hand. Joshua?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
I grew up in the South Bronx, and we used to sneak off with friends of mine to see a Jerry Lewis picture, because my parents were convinced that it had no redeeming social value at all. My folks were opera fans and classical theater fans. But we used to sneak off to the theater, a group of us buddies, so that we could go up to the balcony, and that's where I learned to smoke.
So Lewis's films are a bad influence. Now, this is evident.
Well, you know something? I don't smoke anymore. And maybe that was one of the influences, but it's funny to realize that I'm 83 now, but that we were ahead of my parents' generation, because I am convinced that he really was a comical genius. And he just was way ahead of his times. And I can't remember ever going to anything, or just about anything that he did, which wasn't fall off the chair worth laughing. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua.
I
Thank
don't
you.
know if everyone knows this, but or knows what video assist is, but when you're on a film set, in commercials we call it video assist village, where everyone sits around and they can see what the camera sees on video. Well, Jerry Lewis, I don't want to say he invented that, but when he started directing and acting at the same time, he wanted to be able to see his performances. So he asked his crew to Jimmy rig it. And I think they had like 2 cameras, video cameras next to the shooting camera or a camera, and that's how they did it. But
He
that's
was a pioneer in that.
yeah.
He was a pioneer in something else that is not as great. It's a problem for us moviegoers who love the cinema, but he also tried to get his own cinema circuit off the ground, Jerry Lewis Cinemas. The concept being that they would be automated theaters where there wouldn't be required any staff, except you would have I think it was even a 16mm projector that could be automated. And the whole project didn't work. This was the early 70s, but of course, automated cinemas
idea.
became the mainstream function of major circuits by the 80s and 90s.
And smaller ones as well.
And smaller ones as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Edward from NYC, can you unmute and start your video, please? Hey, Edward.
Yeah, hi. I'm having
Hello.
trouble with the video, but
It's okay.
I'll just go ahead. Yeah, thank you again for a really terrific lecture and presentation. I just love these. I kind of thought about that myself, about what was it real or not, the revelation of his artistry, you know, but it was revealed to us, as I recall, when he was on television. He turned the television on in the bar to Rita, who certainly was real, and to the FBI agents. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, here we go. You know, this is like we're part of the national TV audience now, and he's validating himself to us by showing us the TV, and he turns the TV on for us, you know, which is really funny. But I did see, I came across on YouTube an interview with Scorsese and De Niro, and they talked about, you mentioned about the look of the picture, and De Niro and Scorsese and the production designer were out looking around for the look of Rupert Pupkin. They were trying to figure out, what does this guy look like? And they found themselves at a haberdashery shop in Times Square. I think not at Times Square, I'm sorry. It was near the Stage Deli, I think they said. And they went in. It was called the Shirt Maker to the Stars. You know, it was the name of the guy of the shop. And they saw a mannequin that was dressed in red with a wig and a mustache. And they said, that's who he is. That's Pupkin. So they took it with them. And so that the look of Pupkin was this mannequin from this shirt shop near the Stage Deli.
That red tie, I'm never going to get that out of my head. There's something about that.
And I have to thank you for the anecdote, Edward, also because it's a rare moment when someone can inject the word haberdashery into a modern conversation. So thank you.
My sense was that it was in the Fredericks of Hollywood kind of category. So I didn't know what to say, how to say it, you know.
All right, it's a lovely word.
I think, homage to Harry Truman. The other thing that struck me was that you talked about Lewis directing in his own artistry, but he created the scene with the woman in the telephone booth who wants him to have cancer because he won't give up an autograph, you know, and he directed that scene. And Scorsese said that the comedic timing was flawless. He rehearsed it with them, and I thought that was really a testimony. And I think that this whole picture was just filled with things like that really I really enjoyed. So there we go. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. I guess my final words for myself is that, and I mentioned this the other day as well, that I tend to think of Scorsese in many ways as a comedy director, because even in his most shattering, harrowing, unnerving, unpleasant narratives, there's some element of humor that emerges in some way. And here we have more of a comic framework for his comic skills as a director, but just my theory.
Absolutely agree. I mean, in Goodfellas, we're alternately gasping and laughing, and even Taxi Driver has some laughs, often provided by Albert Brooks, but
or Peter Boyle, yeah, no, exactly.
Okay, we have one more question from Joshua. Joshua?
Unless it's still from before.
Maybe he butt dialed us.
No.
No,
For those of you who think don't know the meaning of the word haberdashery other than Harry Truman, are any of you old enough to remember Sulca and Company on Fifth Avenue? Sulca and Company specialized in custom-made shirts and ties. I patronized them for years. They're now a long gone memory from New York also.
That's great. Thank you, Joshua. And so I know Dan has disappeared on us, but I know we have Dan.
He may be getting a haberdashery catalog.
That was my haberdasher making a house call.
Did you want to share with us information on our upcoming events?
Well, yeah,
Yes,
Lori is
I
going
was
to
going
introduce the lecture.
to let you guys know that coming up on Tuesday, November 15th, we have our New Plaza Cinema lecture with Stephen C. Smith about San Francisco noir. And again, Tuesday, November 15th, starting at 3 p.m. And Dan, you had something to say as well?
Well, I want to also underscore that is a Tuesday, unlike our normal Wednesday lectures that Max gives us. The talkback the following Sunday, November 20th, is going to be on this wonderful film noir called Woman on the Run, which, as you can see, stars the always lovely Ann Sheridan, and her co-star is Dennis O'Keefe. Yep, we all have our restored versions of it. It was lost for a long time, and we now have it back.
Yeah, a real rescue job.
Indeed, there's an interesting story about that I don't have time for now, but we will be absent Max, who will be traveling, and so Gary and I will be hosting along with two guests. One of them would be the aforementioned Stephen Smith, who is going to follow up his lecture to talk about Woman on the Run, which was not completely filmed in San Francisco. But I'm very happy to announce we have a very special new guest, a woman named Imogen Sarah Smith, who would have to be described as a rising star in the world of film commentary and scholarship. She's written two books, one on film noir, one on Buster Keaton. And she does a lot of writing these days for the Criterion Collection. She does a lot of audio commentaries on their releases. The Film Noir Foundation, Film Comment, which is published by Film at Lincoln Center. So she will be adding quite a bit of very erudite and entertaining comment to our show. So I just want to encourage you all to not miss Woman on the Run on the 20th. And I believe that's all we got, folks.
So two important dates, Tuesday, November 15th and Sunday, November 20th for our next lecture and respectively talk back for Woman on the Run. So unless anyone has anything else to say, I think we're done for the day.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Thank you all.
Don't forget to vote.
Thanks, everyone.
Get out and vote.
Don't forget to vote.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you,
again.
everyone.
Watch
Thank you,
the
Joshua.
Nutty Professor if you've never seen it.
Oh, this is great.
Take care,
Bye,
everyone.